Modern Poland is like many Central European countries, busy and prosperous. But from September 1939 to January 1945, Poland was subject to one of the most brutal occupations in human history. During this 5-year period, an estimated 6 million Poles lost their lives under a cruel and oppressive Axis regime. But among these stories of tragedy and despair, there are stories of heroism and bravery. Stories of people who remained defiant throughout, risking their lives to gather intelligence which would save the lives of countless others. Stories of deeply complex resistance structures, from the silent and unseen to the heroic ghetto fighters whose symbolic last stand sent echoes around the world and shocked the Nazi high command. This is the story of Poland's resistance. After 123 years of occupation by the Prussians, Russians, and Austrians, after World War I, the Poles finally get their country back. And they're so proud and they're so patriotic. And they are horrified that both the Soviets and the Nazis have now invaded and are basically there to destroy the Polish state, which they so fought for in the past. And they're just not going to roll over and let this happen. I mean, they realize that militarily they haven't got a hope in actually defeating either of these vast armies. But they're certainly going to give the Nazis and the Soviets a run for their money. And so very, very quickly, the military that's left in Poland starts to organize various resistance cells. And these spring up all over Poland. At the very, very beginning, they're not particularly well organized. But General Sikorski, who's now leading the Polish government in exile, first starts in France and then in London, appoints General Tukhachevsky to take over the coordinating of these military resistance groups in Poland so that there can be some sort of organized resistance that resembles a kind of military operation. These resistance groups begin right away, and they're all over Poland. Witold Pilecki is one of the leaders of a new organization called TAP, which feeds into what later becomes the Polish Home Army. And there are other groups like this as well that are forming all over Poland. And so they start to collect military personnel, people that they've known, fought with, people in their units, and they start to create these, effectively, these underground cells of military resistors. But they're not yet coordinated, and this is very important because one sees that there were so many of them that there was this sort of spontaneous desire to carry on the fight. But it has to become a little bit better organized. And this is where General Sikorski appoints General Tukhachevich to actually say, okay, let's find all of these military units, military personnel, and let's put them under a single unit. And that eventually becomes the Armia Krajowa, the Polish Home Army. So under Witold Pilecki and Jan Włodarkiewicz, the TAP starts to organize. They get together about 800 men. They start getting military equipment. They gather machine guns and so on. So this is one of the organizations that actually demonstrates how the Poles are thinking, how their mental state is just geared toward carrying on the fight. And so they start to get in touch with people who've been in the military and so on. And Witold Pilecki's group is one of the first and one of the largest organizations that then feeds into what becomes the Home Army. The sorts of people who are drawn to the resistance are people who've just been fighting against the Germans and against the Soviets. So it's obvious that they just carry on the fight. Those who haven't been able to get out to France and then fight in the western part of Europe have decided to stay and fight on. So the first layer really is the military, and this sets up the resistance to be a very well organized, effectively military organization. And this very much helps it to be very effective throughout the war. And then it opens up very, very quickly to a whole range of people who've known each other. There's a huge sort of group of intelligentsia in Poland. These are well-educated, university-educated people who've known each other through school, who've known each other through their education. In the 20s and 30s in Poland, there were very, very many organizations that were sort of paramilitary, sort of like the Boy Scouts, but you'd also learn to handle a gun, you'd also learn to read maps, this sort of thing. And so those people knew each other from, perhaps summers in these organizations organizations together. And this was very important because a lot of it was word of mouth. So if you knew somebody from one of these Boy Scout type organizations or Girl Scouts, because there are very many women involved as well, you know, you could vouch for them. So people could vet each other and say, yes, no, this person is trustworthy, we know them. So starting with the military, then going into the Boy and Girl Scout type organizations, and then others as well, very, very quickly, the underground starts to rapidly grow. The aim of these resistance organizations from the very beginning is to disrupt the attempt by the Nazis and the Soviets to destroy their state. In other words, they want to preserve Polishness, and they want to fight against these occupying forces, so that when the Soviets and the Nazis are finally defeated, which the Poles always believe they will be, then they can resume having a Polish state. So this was ultimately a sense of self-preservation, ultimately the desire to keep the Polish state in one form or another intact and running, despite the terrible situation that they find themselves in. The Poles start launching organized guerrilla attacks against the Germans almost straight away. An entire German battalion is taken out by Major Henryk Dobrzhansky. And this is a signal to the Germans that they have to beware, that the Poles are not just going to take their military intervention. And they do start skirmishes, they do start attacks, like guerrilla attacks. They start to organize in the forests, they start to organize little military bases that are under the noses of the Gestapo and the SS, but they're very, very difficult to find. One of the main things they do is disrupt rail travel. They go out and plant bombs on the rail tracks. And so 1 in 8 train transports are disrupted in some way by bombing or by some sort of other attack. These things aren't really going to totally damage the German military effort, actually. But they are annoying, they're irritating, they're frustrating for the Germans. It means that the machine that they're trying to get going in Poland is just not oiled and running smoothly the way they hope. There were other efforts as well to show the Germans that the Poles were not beaten, they were not going to be downtrodden. And one was the creation of a youth group called Wawr. It was named Wawr because this was the site of one of the very big massacres of civilians right at the beginning of the occupation. And so this youth group decided that they were going to protest, and they did things like draw graffiti on the walls against the Germans. And from this graffiti came the very famous symbol of fighting Poland, which is a WP and then a sort of symbol of an anchor. And this started to go up all over Poland on walls and in other places, on pamphlets and other things as well. It was the symbol of resistance against the Germans. Of course, if you were caught putting this graffiti on a building, you could very easily end up being killed. But it became a very important and potent symbol for the resistance in Poland. Probably on balance, the most important part of the resistance in Poland when it comes to the overall picture of World War II is intelligence gathering. It's very, very important for the Poles because they were in constant contact with the Polish Home Army in London. And one of the most famous incidents of this was under Witold Pilecki, who got himself rounded up in one of these so-called łapanki roundups at Plac Wilsona, which was in the northern part of Warsaw. And he was taken to Auschwitz, and from Auschwitz he created a cell to gather information and to try and form a resistance group within Auschwitz to possibly stage an uprising there. The intelligence service in Poland is extraordinary. They come up with some of the great coups of World War II. The first one is the Enigma machine. It's very little known that actually the first cracking of the Enigma code happens in Poland. Although the Enigma is known in the early 1930s already, and it's understood that they want to crack this code, both the British and the French have no success with this. The Poles take a different tack from the British and the French in terms of trying to crack the code. They put on it some of their top mathematicians, and the mathematicians go at cracking this code in a completely different way from the other intelligence services trying to do this, including those who eventually work at Bletchley Park. There was one particular mathematician called Marian Rejewski who really leads this task, and from 1932 already he started to crack the codes, and he builds the first Enigma machine called Bomba, And they actually build 3 of these, and they start to understand that you can only understand the Enigma machine if you understand the electrical wiring that goes inside these rotors. It's a very complicated type of equipment. And he really cracks this along with another team of mathematicians and engineers. And on the eve of the war, in the summer of 1939, the Poles hand all this information over to the French and the British intelligence services. And this forms the basis of what's going to become the successes at Bletchley Park, with the very famous mathematician Alan Turing and the whole team at Bletchley Park, which cracks the Enigma codes and of course gives such a huge advantage to the Western Allies because they can read the information coming out of Germany. Another one of the very famous actions that the underground undertakes is called Most 3, which is bridge number 3. So the Poles have always been watching the Germans as they develop new weapons techniques, and the V2 was no exception. And from the very beginning of the V2 rocket project, the Poles have been spying on the Germans. They've been trying to find out, what are they doing, what are they up to, stealing parts and so on. Well, in May 1944, the Germans are testing these V2 rockets, and one of them goes off course and lands in the muddy banks of the Bug River. And of course the Germans are frantic, they're searching around and everything else, but the Polish underground are ready, and they go out and cover it up with mud and grass. So the Germans can't find it. They're going everywhere, they're going house to house, they start interrogating people, but they can't find this V2 rocket, which is amazing. The Poles smuggle it to Warsaw, where various people in the Home Army, scientists and so on, take a look at it, try and figure it out. They cut it into pieces. Then they bring it to the airport at Blizna, and this Dakota from the 267 squadron, the RAF, fly up from Brindisi with a New Zealand pilot and a co-pilot who's Polish. They land in this muddy field, and this V2 rocket is loaded on board this Dakota. And they have tremendous difficulties taking off because it's so heavy and they're in the mud, and they've got all these AK resistance guys trying to help the plane. The plane finally takes off. They're carrying 4 other passengers, including the very famous courier Jan Nowak-Jażerański, back to London to bring information to the Polish government in exile. And they bring this V2 rocket to London, where of course it's taken apart, and the British learn how the V2 gyro system works and how they can actually try and attack these V2 rockets. So this is one of the other great triumphs of the Polish Home Army during World War II. This marker commemorates the cicho-ciemni, the silent and unseen, the men and women who were trained by the SOE in Scotland and then dropped throughout the war into Poland and also other parts of the occupied territories as well, including France. This monument commemorates a drop that took place on the 9th of August 1944 in the support of the Warsaw Uprising. And of course this is fascinating because it was so close to an SS headquarters, and yet the woods in behind here were complete partisan territory. So the Germans never were able to control the countryside. And once the partisans got into the forest, they were helped by the locals, and there were all sorts of systems in place to make sure that they could then get into Warsaw with all the equipment, the material that they'd brought with them. And none of these people were betrayed, and none of them were given up to the Gestapo, and they managed to perform their tasks in Warsaw during the uprising. With the cicho-ciemni, there were over 316 of them who dropped into occupied Europe. It was incredibly dangerous because, of course, they could be picked up immediately as they dropped, but they could also be discovered and interrogated and tortured. And 103 of them were actually killed, either by the Gestapo or during the operation itself. And so it was a very, very dangerous thing to be doing. But they did land, they did go into places like Germany itself or into Poland, and they became spies, they became radio operators, they did all sorts of things under the noses of the Gestapo. So the bravery of the resistance fighters in Poland is really remarkable. The sorts of things that they did, the risks that they took in the fight, both militarily but also in the underground, was absolutely extraordinary. One of the most audacious actions undertaken by the Home Army was the assassination of the police and SS leader in Warsaw. Franz Kuchera was an Austrian. He had worked his way up in the SS through his sheer brutality. His previous position had been in Mogilev in Belarusia, where he exceeded himself in the massacre, the murder of civilians. So when he was sent to Warsaw in 1943, He was considered to be perfect for the job in trying to keep any kind of resistance in Poland and in Warsaw to a bare minimum. And he did this through sheer terror. Sometimes hundreds of people a month were spontaneously rounded up on the streets and executed just where they were found. The deaths on the streets of Warsaw and other towns and villages in Poland just goes through the roof under Kuchera, and particularly in Warsaw. Now, the Warsaw Home Army has a special unit called Kiff. There's a unit within Kiff which is responsible for the assassination of particularly vile criminals or people that the Home Army feel that they should be getting rid of. And there was a very sophisticated process under the Home Army. There was a decision made by the Home Army court. There was a whole court system where, for example, a German like Kuchera, his name would be put forward, and then he would undergo a trial in absentia. So whether or not it was a good idea to assassinate him, to kill him, this would have to be approved by the government in exile in London. And so in the case of Kuchera, he was targeted because of this extreme violence that he was meting out against the population of Warsaw. A special operative was flown into Warsaw from London, one of the special couriers from the SOE. He was set up to judge the situation, whether or not Kuchera should be killed. The decision was made that he should be assassinated. This monument marks the spot where on the 1st of February 1944, Frank Kuchera, one of the most hated SS police leaders in all of Poland, was murdered. He was being driven from his house just over here, and it's a very, very short drive, but his identity was completely secret. Nobody knew who he was until he'd been identified by the Home Army, the Underground. And so they had decided to do the assassination here, right in front of his office, right in front of the SS headquarters. It was eventually on the 1st of February 1944, and one of the underground cars was swept in and stopped his car. The doors were flung open, and 4 members of the underground shot him, and then they ran away and they tried to escape. Everybody's heard of the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich in Prague, but this was very, very similar and almost as important a person in terms of the SS hierarchy, certainly in Poland. It was a tremendous victory for the Home Army, but of course the reprisals were terrible. Over 400 Poles were very quickly rounded up and shot as a reprisal for the death of Kuchera. And of course the members of the Home Army who had actually undertaken the assassination were also caught, and then there were reprisals and arrests following the death of Kuchera. Two of the people who tried to assassinate him were very badly wounded and died of their injuries. 2 others managed to escape, and they ran across the Kierbierge Bridge, but by this time the Germans had been alerted, and so they were trapped between 2 units of Germans coming toward them on the bridge. They had no other option but to jump over into the water of the Vistula River, and they were shot from the bridge and from the riverbank, so they died as well. Kuchera's death was extremely important because the operation itself was very successful. 4 of the people who were involved in the actual killing ended up themselves being killed. But in terms of the operation, it was successful because with Kuchera's death, it sent a very strong message to the Germans that the AK could get to just about anybody. Perhaps the most famous acts of resistance were the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943 and the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. By 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto has gone through what's called the Großaktion, which is this huge action of murder, effectively, where Jews have been forced onto the place called the Umschlagplatz, which is where they're gathered, forced onto the trains, and most of them are taken up to Treblinka, where they've been murdered. So over 290,000 human beings have been murdered this way by this point, and there's some 50,000 Jews left in the Warsaw Ghetto. On the 19th of April 1943, the Germans decided to completely liquidate the Warsaw Ghetto. There were still about 60,000 people left in the ghetto, and unbeknownst to the Germans, 2 large groups of fighting organizations had organized themselves to resist. These men and women did not just want to go onto the trains because they now knew that they were going to be murdered in Treblinka. They decided to fight. The group that was based here at Miła 18 was called ZOB, the Jewish Fighting Organization. And they fought valiantly for 3 weeks. They were hidden in this area. This area was a huge sort of network of bunkers and underground tunnels and the sewer system and so on. And then the Germans realized they were here and they set in for the attack to kill them all. It's extraordinary to think that beneath my feet here lie the bodies of over 100 resistance fighters who died in the Jewish fighting organization resisting the Germans. And when they realized that there was absolutely no hope, they decided to commit suicide rather than be taken alive by the Germans. This was a heroic resistance against impossible odds of these people who realized that it was better to die with a gun in their hand or with a weapon than to simply go to be killed as the Germans wished them to do. It's an incredible monument to extraordinary bravery and a testament to the Jews of Warsaw. The Polish Home Army had planned for some sort of uprising from the very beginning of the war, really. This was always part of their plan. And then throughout the war, the operation got a name. It was called Operation Burza or Tempest. And this idea was to try and help liberate the cities from the Germans as the Soviets, in this case, came through. Now, originally in the war, they'd hoped that the liberation of Poland would come from the West. But by 1944, it was pretty obvious that liberation, as it were, was going to come from the East, from the Red Army. And this, of course, accorded for a change in plans, because the Poles weren't quite sure about what was going to happen once the Red Army came through to them. And so they started to develop a plan called Burza. The original idea was that they're going to send Home Army fighters out to eastern Polish cities, which are no longer part of Poland, but in those days were considered to be Polish cities, and to help liberate them with the help of the Red Army, of course, and then sort of show themselves to be both co-victors, but also cooperative with the Red Army. They did this in places like Vilnius and Lvov, but what happened was that all of the soldiers were very warm to one another and danced and celebrated their victory. Very soon the NKVD would show up and they started to arrest the Polish Home Army fighters. Many of them were killed, some of them were sent to the Gulag. And so of course the leadership of the Polish Home Army in Warsaw watched this with great trepidation. So there were a number of crucial things that really set up the Warsaw Uprising in the summer of 1944. The first one is the Soviet success in Operation Bagration, where they sweep in very, very quickly, past Minsk and into Polish territory. And then Stalin sets up a Polish puppet government in Lublin. Another thing that happens is the assassination attempt on Hitler on the 20th of July 1944, because this gives the Polish Home Army in Warsaw the mistaken impression that the Germans are finished. And this, along with the massive German troops who are fleeing the Red Army, gives the false sense that, well, the Germans are collapsing. The other thing that's crucial, which is sort of the opposite, is General Walter Model is put in to place by Hitler in July 1944 to mount a counterattack against the Red Army. And it just so happens that this is going to take place just outside of Warsaw. So the Home Army decides that the Red Army is sweeping through, they're just about to come and liberate Warsaw. So what do? Well, we have to show the rest of the world that we do not want to be ruled from Berlin, but nor do we want to be ruled from Moscow. They argued that if they stage an uprising in Warsaw, it's going to be quite easy to just push the Germans out because the Germans are fleeing anyway. And so that they can, in a sense, have a proverbial red carpet, that they push the Germans out, roll this out, and welcome the Soviets into their capital city, shake their hands as equals, as co-victors. And this is the concept. And this is a very nice idea. However, it's flawed by one thing, which is the counteroffensive that Walter Model undertakes just outside of Warsaw, the end of July 1944. So instead of the Soviets sweeping into Warsaw and liberating it, instead you have the Germans pushing the Red Army back, giving it a bloody nose, and really halting it in its tracks. This doesn't mean that later on in August or in September, Stalin couldn't have militarily come and help to liberate Warsaw. But because of this counteroffensive, he chose not to. The problem was that Bor Komorowski and the AK leadership in Warsaw heard the sounds of this battle at the end of July 1944 and said, the Red Army is just on the gates of Warsaw. We have to act now. So on the 1st of August, 5 o'clock, they gave the order to start the uprising. And of course, in reality, it was actually a disastrous time because the Germans were just forcing the Red Army back. So the Poles had actually great successes in the very first moments of the uprising because the Germans were taken by surprise and the Poles managed to gain control of a large chunk of the city. But unfortunately, they didn't get the airports, they didn't get the bridges, they didn't get other very important communication areas. And also these chunks of the city were separated by very important and powerful German communication links. And so it was really like section by section by section of the city that was taken by the AK. And although it covered a lot of ground, it really wasn't militarily sustainable. In 1944, in August, the uprising broke out. And the first stages of the uprising were in the west of the city, which was much more open, much easier for the Germans to conquer. But then they came to the Old Town, this area that I'm in now. And you can see behind me, the streets are narrow. The walls are medieval or Renaissance, very, very thick, very, very hard to maneuver, very difficult for tanks to get through. So the fighting in this area was absolutely vicious. And the problem was that because Hitler couldn't get his tanks through, he started to bomb and bomb and bomb this area. So daily, from morning to night, this region was bombed. The other tragedy that happens is that on the 1st of August, in the evening, Himmler goes to see Hitler, having heard news of the uprising, and he finds Hitler in an absolute rage. His eyes are bulging, he's purple in the face, saying, "These horrible Poles, how could they do this?" And Himmler says, "Well, mein Führer, this isn't really great timing, but let's take this opportunity to erase Warsaw from the map. We've always come up against this horrible capital city. It's the epicenter of all the things that are hateful about Poland. So let's destroy it." So they come up with this order for Warsaw on the evening of the 1st of August 1944, in which it says all men, women and children are to be killed, whether or not they're combatants. And once the city has been emptied of its population, the city is to be glatt rasiert, which is razed to the ground. And this is really what happens. Hitler decides that Himmler should be in control of this operation because the military are busy with Walter Model outside of the city. And so Himmler gets a hold of his former cronies in places like Bielorussia, these terrible criminals like Erich von den Bach-Zaleski and Oskar Dörlewanger and Bronislaw Kamiński. These are absolute killers. These are people who've trained at killing civilians, and they're unleashed on the people of Warsaw. So what happens over the next 63 days is a systematic destruction, first of the population. In the district of Wola alone, for example, around 30,000 people are massacred in one day. And then after the population has been subdued, and later on Erich von den Bach-Zaleski decides that he's not going to kill everybody, he starts shipping the population out to a transit camp called Pruszków, although the murders still continue. Once the capitulation takes place in the beginning of October 1944, all of the population is forced out of the city. Some of them are sent to concentration camps, including Auschwitz and Ravensbrück. Some of them are sent as slave laborers into the Reich, and the others are expected to go and find somewhere to live in the countryside. And then the city of Warsaw is destroyed house by house, street by street, blown up by special units, special sapper units, which level the city to the ground. The legacy of the Warsaw Uprising remains controversial. There's some people who say it was a total disaster. Warsaw was completely destroyed, hundreds of thousands of people were killed or ended up being displaced, and that therefore it wasn't worth it. But there's another school of thought that says, well, first of all, it was a stand against the Germans, and it was also a stand against the Soviets. It was a plea from the Poles to say, we don't want to be governed from Berlin, but we don't want to be governed from Moscow either. And that perhaps this was worth it, this attempt to use their incredible force, the Polish Home Army, to actually fight against the Germans, because they feared that if they didn't do anything, that the Soviets would just say, oh, they were cowards, they didn't fight against the Germans, and they didn't help to liberate their own city, and that politically it would be much worse for them after the war. The story of the uprising has, in Warsaw, certainly come to symbolize the resistance of the Poles fighting in the war. But the resistance is actually much broader than just the Warsaw Uprising. It encompasses the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which was of equal importance and symbolically, just morally, enormously important in the history of Poland and the whole history of Polish-Jewish struggle during World War II and in the Holocaust. But there were other elements of resistance as well. Just the creation of the whole underground state and the underground army with hundreds of thousands of people participating. The creation of Żegota, the tremendous work of Witold Pilecki in Auschwitz to try and bring the horrors of Auschwitz to the rest of the world. The getting the Enigma machine and decoding the Enigma is an incredible feat of bravery in the war, actually. And the getting a V2 rocket and getting it to England. These are just a few examples of the tremendous work that was done by men and women of the resistance in Poland, of the Polish Home Army, of the underground. I had relatives who were Canadians who worked in the SOE, and one of them told me that aside from his own buddies, the guys he worked with in his own unit, the people he trusted absolutely the most with his life were the Poles that he also worked with from the SOE. So they really did distinguish themselves, and it was an extraordinary effort from a country that had been occupied, invaded from both sides, from the Soviet Union and the Nazis, and then was the battleground for the Nazis' invasion of the Soviet Union, and then back again in 1944, that the Poles, in all sorts of walks of life, in all levels of society, of all ages, men and women, managed to create such an extraordinary force of resistance against the Nazi regime.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.